Have you ever seen a deal implode? Because we started talking about, cultural or regulatory kind of blind spots.
Yes, the answer is yes, and I've seen many. I think it's always the potential misunderstanding. When you think we have a handshake and it turned out not to be the case. I was working on a transaction first time in Japan. I would get very excited going to meetings, and walking out of my first meetings, I will always say, oh, we have a deal. Look, everybody agreed. Our Japanese advisor, he would come to me and like, no, they did not agree at all. They actually don't like anything we said. I think being able to know the landscape, speak the language, being proficient in navigating sort of what's wrong is an essential skill to have.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of This is M&A. My next guest is the managing partner of Laurel Hollow Capital, where he brings more than 25 years of global healthcare investment and operational experience across MedTech, pharma, biotech, and healthcare services. He's executed over 100 transactions spanning from 13 plus countries with deal sizes ranging from the millions to the billions. His career includes senior roles at Pagoda Capital, Fosun Group, China's largest asset manager, and Henry Schein, a Fortune 500 company, where he led cross-border M&A in Asia Pacific. He also serves on the board of Hamilton Thorne, a U.S. public company, and holds an MBA from Wharton School, along with advanced degrees in microbiology and genetics. So he knows this space inside and out. In his spare time, he's an avid skier in the winter and passionate cyclist in the summer, and loves exploring the outdoors with his wife and 3 children along hikes. With that, everyone, please meet my guest, Feng Han. Feng, welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. Very happy to join the podcast.
Happy to have you. I know you and I chatted, I believe it was last year at one of the big bio events. I enjoyed our conversation. I enjoyed your background. I thought it would make a great voice on the mic today. So I've been really looking forward to having you on. Happy you and I finally have a chance to get this dialed and get this done.
Yeah, same here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Definitely. And as you know, and just the audience, ShareVault's virtual data room, one of our core niches is in the life science spaces. We're really big in all thing regulatory compliance, that being one of the industries we serve, hence how Feng and I came to connect with one another. With all that being said, today we're going to dive into the world of cross-border M&A, especially in healthcare and beyond. We're going to ultimately unpack the opportunity and risk that are there in cross-border transactions. We're going to talk about why healthcare deals across borders are uniquely complex. We're also going to touch on the future of global M&A in today's economic and geopolitical environment. So with all that being said, we have a lot to cover. We're going to want to jump right in. Feng, where should we actually get started?
I think it's really anywhere you want to direct. But I think especially relevant to life sciences as innovation is increasingly global. And especially right now, even last year, 40% of the transactions happened, originating out of China. And the wide expectation is there's going to be, 5 years later, there's going to be at least 3/4 of the innovations or the deals coming out of China. I think maybe the conversation may be more relevant to, where the buck is going is probably talking about, I think what's relevant to people is how to do deals, from an investor, from big multinational companies, how to navigate the transactions involving sort of Chinese biotechs or MedTech companies. I think that's probably more relevant now than ever in today's environment.
Speaking to that point, right, we're talking cross-border deals, China in specific. What's one of the biggest differences that you see between domestic versus cross-border deals? Let's start with kind of painting that picture first.
Sure. I think there's first of all, I think structurally the laws are very different. So in some particular countries, especially the enforcement of law, the regulatory environment are quite different. So I think the knowledge of different geographies, different regulatory frameworks, the necessary regulatory hurdles you need to cross, I think that's just on the very basis. And on top of that, there's also the softer element, which is the cultures are different in terms of negotiations, in terms of how the deal are conducted. I think familiarity and knowledge about those cultural elements, is fundamentally very important. I'll give you one example. So when I was working for Henry Schein, I was working on transaction first time in Japan. So, I would get very excited going to meetings and whereas walking out of my first meetings, I will always say, "Oh, we have a deal. Look, everybody agreed." And our Japanese advisor, at that time was one of, I forgot the exact name, but one of the most famous invest banks in Japan. He would come to me and like, no, they did not agree at all. They actually, don't like anything we said. So, needless to say that, the familiarity of the culture and people's responses, the softer stuff is also very important, how to build relationships. In a lot of M&As, I think the ability to communicate, to connect with people are also on the other side is also, fundamentally very important. So there is a hard part and a soft part. So the two parts also very, I think in order to get a deal done, uh, are both important.
I agree. I've actually also had worked for a Japanese company, and it took me a while to get used to the culture. Very different. I learned really quickly that when the boss is there, you make sure you're there first, and when the boss leaves, he sees you still there.
That's correct. That's correct.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I worked for a big multinational company called NEC. You might be familiar with them. I had a short stint there. I realized quickly I wasn't big company material. I found my place in startups. So, but out of curiosity, have you ever seen a deal implode? Because we started talking about cultural or regulatory kind of blind spots. Have you ever seen a deal explode because or implode because of one of those?
Yes, the answer is yes, and I've seen many throughout, various of periods of my career. I think it's always the potential misunderstanding, right? When you think we have a handshake and it turn out not to be the case, oftentimes it hurts the trust needed, the level of trust needed between the two parties to come to a transaction. Even after a transaction happened, there is expectation of certain ways of behavior. And sometimes the differences in understanding of the cultures of the behaviors can also lead to unnecessary misunderstanding. In some cases, could cause significant breakdowns of a particular transaction.
Been some mega deals that have fallen apart because of the culture side of the house. It couldn't successfully integrate it.
That's very true. Especially a more recent example, Novo Nordisk spent, I think, $1.3 billion, bought an asset from a Singapore-based biotech company called KBP Biosciences. And right now, the two parties ended up being in court, fighting through New York arbitration court now. Mostly direct result was because of failed phase 3 trials. But what's interesting is, Fierce Biotech has a three-part sort of very in-depth analysis of what went wrong in terms of the transaction. And, from the details, a lot of these communications, how, after the phase 3 results and, came out, and the level of communications between a big sort of Danish company versus a small Chinese biotech, I think there's certainly cultural and communication element in there that caused this. Funny enough, I think a lot of evidence in terms of pointing fingers toward each other from the parties. I think one of the key evidence was who did what using data room, which is what I think to use a high quality data room provider is fundamentally very important in the transaction process as well.
Obviously, I would agree with that. I think it sends the right signal, and it sends the early signals to how easy are you going to be to do business with, or how complicated is this deal going to be to get over the line.
I would encourage anybody who is interested to read those, the report from Fierce Biotech and this fascinating rate.
Yeah, definitely. Before we jumped on, you and I are having a brief chat about where you've been. You were just in Vienna. You're at one of the bio events, deal making, partnering, licensing, all of that good stuff happens at those events. They connect deal makers, connect CEOs with deal makers, etc. Ear to the ground. What are you hearing right now? Are they expecting the market to kind of rebound a bit more going into 2026? Is there some optimism, or what are you hearing from the sources out there?
I think for one thing, I've been going to Bio Europe, which is organized by EBD Group. I think this is the flagship event for biotech, especially centralized in Europe, but not only Europe, but Asia as well. So all the major Japanese pharma companies and Korean pharma companies out there. So are a lot of, Chinese biotech and European biotech, including American biotech companies. So in general, a couple of major observations. One is people are definitely more optimistic than previous years, at least last year's. I think the reason for that is really the public market reflected, and a lot of public companies has swing back, especially this year has been performing pretty well. And there's new biotech companies going IPO. So people have, in general, feels that it's driven, and at the same time, the biotech funding environment is slowly coming back. On the private side, it's not completely sort of floodgate open yet, but it's slowly coming back. So from that standpoint, that's number one, right? The capital market. And number two is the aggressive deal making from big pharma. We see, especially Pfizer just up, fighting out with the Novo and just offered $10 billion for Metsera, right? So we all know that, and it's just one reflection of how desperate all the big pharmas or urgent they feel to do sizable deals. And thirdly, I think it's the amount of cash from the buyers, whether it's big pharma or some public or private biotech companies, even early stage, have been able to raise, $300 million, $500 million round. So that gives people sort of a lot of firepower to look for assets. At the same time, I think finally, this is sort of another, I don't have any scientific analysis to say, how innovation has come about, but there's increasingly, amount of high quality innovations coming out of China, especially because of the past few years, a lot of investment have been made in China, and also because of the availability of the patients and trials and the engineering. So in general, I think this year's event has much more positive tone compared to previous few years.
That's what I'm hearing from the street as well. It seems like there's a lot more optimism going into next year. This year was a bit rough for the life science industry as a whole. Deal making slowed, cash wasn't being deployed. But going into next year, and even the back half of this year, we've slowly started to see an uptick. Obviously, we pay a lot of attention to this particular sector, and we're starting to see it starting to slowly rebound. I'm not going to say it's rebounded, but it's rebounding. It's heading in the right direction. Starting to see more deals get over the line. Some deals were stalled, right? The deals were dragging out, taking longer to close for obvious reasons. But you're starting to see them close now. So it'll be exciting to see what 2026 has in store for the industry as a whole. And I think everybody's been waiting for that breakout year. And I think 2026 could be that year. So we'll see. As long as we can get some certainty in the world, I think is what's really has been holding us up quite significantly.
Yes. Yes. And AI, obviously technology, AI is a big topic. We're starting to see some productivity gains driven by technology in the biotech sector. So people are excited about that too.
Just to kind of shift gears for a second here, a question for you, just having to do with, again, we're going to really hone in on the life science component of this. Can you talk to us about a deal, because you've been involved in lots of deals, lots of cross-border deals, as we described in your background, where IP looked good, but the cross-border complexity is what killed it. So maybe not just the culture of the cross-border, but just cross-border as a whole, the complexity of it kind of killed that deal.
Typically, in this case, I see the question there. But in terms of, I think not necessarily kill any deal, but it really drives the type of transactions that as a buyer or seller, the availability of the type of transactions or the preferred way of doing transactions, right? So, for example, a MedTech deal that even going back 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the geopolitical situation is much more friendly. It's very common if you are Medtronic or Boston Scientific. It's very common for larger companies just go into China and make an acquisition, a whole company, very, from big or small. So, straight acquisitions of companies versus sort of licensing the asset is more M&A. Pure M&A is probably more prevalent 5-10 years ago. And today is very rarely you see anything happens. The overall geopolitical situation is a lot worse. I think owning a whole, buying a whole company strictly from China for manufacturer purposes or IP purposes, people have resorted more of sort of licensing type of deal, right? So, and increasingly the two markets get separated, especially even for licensing deal. Many deals are ex-China, right? Versus in China. So I think certainly, I think geopolitics has driven a lot of different transactions to fit the different needs and risk sort of management in terms of the different deal structures often become more important when people are considering cross-border transactions.
Got it. Makes sense. Through some of the lessons that you've learned through the deals that you've worked on, what are some tips you would give to my audience on what they should be cautious about in cross-border, or what are some tips or tricks that you can share that will help ensure their success as they navigate these cross-border waters? Maybe you can give us some guidance on that.
Sure. I think in general, I think cross-border, especially in the healthcare, in life sciences, that's where healthcare is global, right? I think different pockets of the market have fundamentally very different advantages when it comes to innovation. The U.S. is very fundamentally science-driven. And China just have the population. It's much easier, cheaper to do the trials. Recruiting patients is much easier. And also the cost is much lower, and just from the biological standpoint, molecule standpoint, the engineering capabilities in China, just the sheer size of the market and the number of companies there, it just have a distinct advantage. So, to be able to have a global view and more transact, I think, looking at the innovation, looking at the asset across geographies on a worldwide basis is sort of a must, right? For any drug hunters. If you are, VP, if in charge of business development or M&A for Pfizer or a biotech company, I think being able to know the landscape, speak the language, being proficient in navigating sort of what's around cross-border I think it's an essential skill to have.
Real quick on point number one, obviously you got years and years of experience in this, but what would be a way that you would recommend for them to stay in tune with that component that you're describing? Is part of what you're doing is like the bio events? Is that an example of making sure you're front and center, present with what's going on in the world, in the industry, et cetera? I mean, I think you mentioned Fierce Biotech as well. Are those examples of sources of where you get some of your information to make sure you're kind of keeping in tune with the market?
Certainly. I think, certainly industry publications, right? Endpoint, Fierce Biotech, they're global. I think also, some of my friends from Endpoint actually being sent the establishing China team. So establishing sending people to China and doing local reporting. So keep rest of things developing in China is very important, or elsewhere. I think global publications. A second is, as you suggested, going to these events, right? About Europe, about China, bio here in the US. There's many other regionals. I think going to these events, you meet companies and seeing different assets, have the knowledge there. So I think all very important. And I think specifically, I think there is also value working with advisors, a global, advisory firms such like us. We are small firm, but we're global. We have partners located in Europe, in Asia. I'm based out of New York. We have partners located in San Francisco. So have a sort of working with advisors, which who can bring in sort of global view and expertise. I think is important too.
As you're looking at the market and where it's headed, we talked a bit about that. Do you see any new hotbeds for cross border? I know you hinted to China obviously being one of them, but are you seeing anywhere else that folks should be aware of, more specifically for healthcare M&A?
In general, it depends on where you are in healthcare, right? So I think people are talking about healthcare, but MedTech is very different from biotech. And even within MedTech, I think there's the cardio space is very different from, robotics, right? Robotic surgery. So I think specifically, if you talk about just naturally, I think, the ecosystems of different places tend to create a lot of different innovations, different opportunities. For example, Israel has a very thriving sort of innovative space for medtech in general. So, right. And Heartflow and plus a couple other things all came from there. So if you are a medtech guy, I'm sure you've been to, Tel Aviv many times. RNA technology, there's only a few buckets, obviously Boston, but Germany, Berlin, around Munich area, and as well as UK, right? UK has, Macera is the original technology came out of, I think, Imperial College. So I think my advice would be, if you are in the field, you probably know the pockets of the innovations and the pockets where those are. Typically, most of the deals happening is also as a result of those, so from those different places. So it's truly global. I think, for anybody, whether they're working on bispecifics or ADCs, I think China is where to go. San Diego is where you should go.
San
And
Diego, Boston, those kind of the hubs in the US for sure. Let's shift the discussion really quickly more around founders that are domestic but are looking to go international. Are there any tips that you can share or any advice that you can share? What's that one thing that founders should be thinking or should nail? I guess the one thing they should get right before they go from being domestic to go global.
great question. I think if you are a biotech entrepreneur or medtech entrepreneur, you need to be global, right? Because the same type of disease or the problem you're trying to solve, their patients, it's the same type of patients. A diabetes patient here has the same problems as a diabetes patient in Europe or in Africa for that matter. So I think, it's one thing interests me most why healthcare in the field is because you really see people's innovative mindset, even though they come from different countries. So if you're a founder trying to solve a problem, I think having the knowledge of what people are working on, where are those people from, before you sort of devote your hard, time and very precious time on venture, and it's very important. So knowledge on a global basis. And second, increasingly so, I think for any founders to develop companies, you would need capital. And increasing so, especially the larger venture capital firms or family offices, they look at assets on a global basis, and their knowledge in a particular area is very deep. They know most of the innovators. If you have a great idea, I think is for fundraising purposes, it's very important to look at the sources of funding globally. I think that's number two. Number three, if you are founder of a company, you're already certain size and sort of look at the market globally. Europe is very different from, for example, Japan in terms of a different disease area, whether it's rare disease or others. So having the knowledge and the connections and potential deals, synergies, you also need to sort of keep a global mindset. Going to these events, global events, is very important. Better yet, I think to constantly, as I mentioned earlier, I think being a little bit open to different cultures and how people sort of behave, customs, is sort of acquired scale.
Those are the delicacies that sometimes could make or break a deal. And it's even domestic, right? The culture from one state to the next. There's some subtleties that have play big roles and big differences. I remember when I was in my greener years and I went to Utah and I learned really quickly, coffee, asking someone to go out for a beer, it's not as common there because of culture, because of religion, because of, right, so many other things. So it's important to understand that component of it. Fame, this conversation's been great. I want to pivot it to you now. I think it's a good segue, a good opportunity for us to talk about you for a second. How did you get into healthcare? What made you choose that path amongst all things M&A? Why'd you go down the path of the healthcare route?
For me, I originated from China, studied in college microbiology. So I was always interested in life science. The science part has got me excited and interesting. So it wasn't until I ended up working for Sanofi, being their number 2 employee for the Sanofi's vaccine business in China, the mid-90s. Yes. So I remember I would travel around. Again, this was in mid-90s where there's probably only 1 or 2 airlines in China, in the whole nation. And I think I traveled to 30 different cities and just talk about what influenza is, and there's actually a vaccine to prevent it. So I think it just says how far we have become, right?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot more than 2 airlines in China. We'll start there.
Yes, certainly have. But I came to the States in 98. I went to a PhD program at Michigan State doing breast cancer research. So published author. And, I think when I look at the market, I'm more interested in the commercial side. So after business school, I joined Schein, and I'm really interested in deal making. I think it's one of those, equivalent of some of the business books really opening my eyes. I think a good deal, or many good deals, can really create a lot of value, right? Especially the companies being able to work together, to consolidate all the resources and to explore the synergies, really is foundation of deal making. And to make a good deal requires not only the knowledge of life sciences, but, finance, legal, experience does make a big difference in terms of whether you have a good deal or a bad deal. So it was fortunate that being able to have some great mentors, with Schein, with Henry Schein or Fosun, lastly with Pagoda Capital. So really have was able to stand sort of on the top to look at the transaction on a global basis. We've done deals from a few million to a couple of $1 billion, and working with some of the biggest investors, as well as, most impressive founders, really broaden the horizon. I think, that's a few years ago, I came out of retirement and early retirement and doing an advisory firm, which is Laurel Capital, having a lot of fun advising companies, really trying to sort of help companies, extract value or create value through various transactions, opportunities or partnerships, and licensing or M&A activities. So I think that's how I got into it. I love, sort of not to quote, our president, the art of the deal, without getting controversial. But I do think that, there's a tremendous, amount to be said about our art of deal and being able to, leverage the experience. So I really enjoy the technicalities and the culture element because of my own background. So yeah, I think most of our clients highly appreciate that too. Yeah.
I would imagine so. Feng, I really appreciate you giving us some insight into yourself. Naturally, we went down the path of why should people get in touch with you? Because I think you touched on that. But how can people get in touch with you?
LaurelHollowCapital.com has all our information, our partners information. We have, as I mentioned earlier, our partners, founders, previous founders, CEOs, CFOs for, various all healthcare background, different geographic focuses, and all our contact information is on our website.
I appreciate that. And I'm sure our listeners are going to enjoy our conversation. I'd love to have you back on the show. We can dive deeper into some of the life science specific topics. We unpacked quite a bit here, but there's plenty more we can obviously talk about in the future. But thank you for joining the podcast. It's been a pleasure since I met you from day one.
Thank you, Stephen, for really enjoy the conversation. Thank you for the opportunity. And, hopefully we can do something deeper in the future.
That's a wrap on another episode of This is M&A. We'll see you on the next episode. Until then, stay sharp and stay deal ready.
If this episode sharpened your thinking, share it, post your take, follow the show, or drop a quick review and bring it into your next deal. We'll be back with more real talk from people who've been in the room when it counted. The views and opinions expressed on This is M&A are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect the views of any company or organization mentioned. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, financial, or investment advice. Always consult a qualified professional before making business decisions.